Hello. 50 years ago, the West was shaken and stirred by a wave of revolutionary protest led by students and in some countries by workers as well. But what was the legacy of '68? What does it mean today? Richard Vinan's the author of The Long 68, a study of the phenomenon from the United States to Britain, France to Italy. But I guess it's the images of Parisian students hurling paving stones at the police that many of us think about first. Agnès Poirier has made a study of French intellectuals, the women of the left bank included, from the war years onwards, and Roger Scruton was there at the time, in Paris in '68, but it was not, I think, hurling stones very much. Conservative philosopher Roger Scruton. Finally, we're going to bring things right up to date with the Paris correspondent of The Economist, Sophie Pedder, who's been writing a biography of President Emmanuel Macron, the man many think who is putting Paris back at the centre of Europe once more. Richard, let me start with you. You've called it the Long 68. What does that mean?
Well, it means a period that takes it beyond just a single year. It seems to me it's a slightly kind of constraining focus just to get that 1 year. The French have talked for a long time about les années 68, which they date from the end of the Algerian War, I suppose, till the election of Mitterrand in the early 80s. But oddly enough, I think that's an analysis that works better for a lot of countries other than France. I think France does have a particular drama around May 68, and elsewhere, often you see the most important aspects of kind of 68 as a spirit at times other than 68 the year.
All the countries that you discuss in your book were involved in the Second World War. To what extent is this, as it were, the thawing out of the self-discipline of the war generation and its replacement by people who no longer really remember the war and see the world very differently?
That's an interesting question. So it's certainly something that some of the enemies of 68 say. This is a generation who don't remember 68. But it's different, I think, in continental Europe to America or Britain. So Daniel Cohn-Bendit, the leader of the French students, always claims he's actually conceived on the day that the liberation of France begins, because his parents are German Jewish refugees taking refuge in France, and this is the moment of kind of hope at which life begins again. So for a man like that, even though he didn't,
that's very important. Yes,
he lived, haunted by the Second World War.
In the States, where a lot of this starts, there's two great events, I suppose. There's the civil rights movement, and then later on, there's the big protests against the Vietnam War. Is that really the origins of what you call 68?
Yeah, the civil rights movement. I think also to some extent the kind of end of McCarthyism in the early 60s, so a group of people who are not communists but don't define themselves as anti-communist either. So I think those three things, civil rights, the end of anti-communism, and Vietnam, other things.
And I guess all around the world what we call second wave feminism as well. First wave feminism, I guess, being the fight for the vote, suffragettes and all the rest of it. Second wave feminism, again, starting in American universities particularly.
Yeah, and I suppose women's liberation, which some people would say is rather different from feminism, rather less concerned with kind of equality of rights and rather more concerned with a kind of assertion of difference, which is perhaps something that you get in the aftermath of 68.
One of the themes in your book is the sort of split or division between student radicalism on the one hand and working class people around the world on the other. And I wonder to what extent the fact that it starts with Vietnam protests drives that.
I think it drives it a lot in the United States, and I think it drives it because the student radicals is in the States more than anywhere else end up hostile to bits of the northern white working class. For complicated reasons. The northern white working class aren't necessarily in favour of the Vietnam War because, after all, their sons are fighting it. But I think they're opposed to opposition to the Vietnam War. They don't like the kind of flamboyance of left-wing radicalism by the late 60s.
And to a certain extent, it's the socially conservative, patriotic working class versus the urbanite, metropolitan, young university intellectuals, a split that you can still see today.
I think that increasingly becomes the case, yeah. So I think probably up until about the mid-60s, there's even in America, there's a bit of a kind of running in parallel. Lyndon Johnson, who after all is someone who's got very strong poverty alleviation programs and so on, and who's aiming at the white working class.
Half the way with LBJ.
Exactly, halfway there with LBJ as the Students for Democratic Society slogan of the mid-1960s. And then Vietnam is what pushes them to the left, and what repels their anti-Vietnam protest is partly what repels part of the white working class.
There's so much to talk about here, but I must ask a little bit about Britain, because we didn't really have 68 in the same way that other countries did. It was pretty limited to a couple of universities, or a few universities and a few meetings, really.
I think that's right. I think part of the reason for that is British universities, of course, are smaller than American universities. The British university population is smaller than the continental European university population. And British universities are very fragmented. So in my own institution, King's College London, is about 200 yards away from the London School of Economics. The LSE, of course, is one of the big centres of radicalism in 68. King's College London is being run at the time by General Sir John Hackett, who's like, the Jack Massue of Britain, a kind of parachute general running a university. As always said, I don't know whether this is true or not, but people I knew when I arrived at King's always told me that Hackett used to go over to the LSE and have a look at their defences and, advise them. He said you wouldn't stand a long siege here.
Yeah. And so this is a wider point, but certainly in terms of Britain, what, if any, do you think are the long-term implications? Because you can look at British universities now and see some of the same things that you saw in the 60s. The safe spaces movement, roads must fall, huge interest in anti-imperialism, anti-racism, and all of that.
Yeah. Obviously, 68 is such a kind of many-headed thing. You can see its legacy in lots of different areas. So there's a legacy, I think, in terms of just conventional democratic politics. One of the things that actually happens is political parties tend to recruit more members in the 1970s after 68, even though people had often been against democratic politics in 68. Daniel Cohn-Bendit, the French student leader, was interviewed last week, and he was asked a lot about the relationship between current protest and what happened in 68. And he said two very interesting things. He said one of which was that in 1968, no one had asked us about the relationship we had with 1918, and we should remember this is 50 years ago.
Yeah.
And the second, which does strike me as very true about my students, is he said, in 1968, we were not frightened of the future. And I think it's probably true that students now are quite frightened of the future.
That's very, very interesting. You make the point later in the book about the number of 68ers who then go in and become sort of classic sort of bourgeois workers and so forth. They get office jobs and they become entirely sort of part of the machine, working for the man or becoming the man, I suppose, as well. Sometimes, yes. I think we can denigrate 68ers too much. My own personal view about 68 is a bit like my view of the Salvation Army. I think it's probably they mean well, although I find them a bit strange. But I think the majority of 68ers don't sell out. They often go into quite kind of modest things as teachers, social workers, things like that. So there's a group of people who become prominent politicians, a group of people who become kind of big media stars. But there are lots of 68ers who do actually live out their ideals in quite understated ways. Let's come to Paris, because although the long 68 in France goes on for, as you say, a very, very long time indeed, 68 in Paris really means only a couple of months, doesn't it? It means particularly May. So it's a big surprise, I think, in France. I mean, there are stirrings in French universities before May 68. De Gaulle's in charge. De Gaulle's in charge. De Gaulle is just coming up to the 10th anniversary of his return to power. Famously as an article, France is bored, published very shortly before the May events. And people tend to assume that France is going to escape rather lightly from agitation that's happening in other places in 1968. And it begins really at Nanterre University, a place we will talk about later on. Yeah, it begins at Nanterre, one of those kind of classic 60s universities created in 1964, very much part of the university expansion of the 1960s, and very much a kind of place where overcrowding and so on is felt by students, I think. I said at the beginning that, we all have these images in our head of students tearing up cobblestones and so forth. This is partly because in France there's a very strong understanding of the need for theatre and street theatre and the idea of spectacle. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of 68 actually occurs in a theatre. They occupy a theatre in the Latin Quarter, and it occurs in quite a small space, really, in the 5th and 6th arrondissement of Paris. And yes, it's a thing in which people are very conscious of performing and making a kind of public display. Agnès Poirier.
I wonder what you made of Raymond Aron's book, which I found illuminating. He wrote it just a few weeks after the events, and it's called La Révolution Introuvable, which literally is the nowhere to be found revolution. And he talks about, he puts it in context, and he says that after 1789, the French Revolution, the French have always, in retrospect, magnified their revolutions. And because they are a profoundly conservative society, they like to allow themselves, like theatre, to as a kind of elation, living in the moment, daydreaming, but because they know very well they are going to go back to what they have accepted so far. So I wonder of what
it's a kind of holiday from the current the permanent state of France.
Exactly, this sort
Periodic.
of imaginary antithesis to the reality, or as he called it, I think the utopian negation of reality. As an Englishman, how do you view that?
Aron, I think, thinks of himself as a very Anglo-Saxon figure, and is actually in the United States at the beginning of the events of '68, has to rush back to denounce them. I think Aron's a bit unfair in that he presents it very much as a movement of bourgeois students. Of course, there's this huge working-class strike in May 1968, which in some ways is the most dramatic aspect of '68 in France, and not all the students are bourgeois. So there has been a certain amount of social mobility in France in the run-up to 1968, probably not many workers going to university, but people being pulled in from the lower middle class and so on. So Aron's own background, which of course a background he famously shares with Jean-Paul Sartre, is much more privileged than the background, I think, of a lot of the students.
It does back, though, the workers. He thinks that they have legitimate demands.
He thinks he thinks that workers have a kind of limited set of demands, and talks about what he regards as the more effective workers' movements of places like West Germany and Scandinavia, which have kind of a social democratic setup. French workers, of course, rather like the students sometimes, don't seem to know quite what they want, so they're rebelling against their own trade unions in 1968 as well as rebelling against the bosses or capitalism.
I must come to Roger Scruton now, because you were there at the time, Roger. You were in a high apartment looking down on the street. Just tell us a little bit about what you saw and how you reacted.
Yes, I was in an apartment I borrowed from someone who was part of the street theatre. She belonged to Armand Gatti's little troupe, much influenced by Antonin Artaud. And
you're going to have to explain that. I think,
well, this was part of that street theatre tradition, which goes back an awful long way. And Gatti was at the centre of these demonstrations, trying to organise them as theatre. He got hit on the head radically by one of the policemen and was out of action thereafter. But I stayed out of it because I was a student at Cambridge at the time. I happened to be there because it was our vacation, looking down at the Place de Contrescarpe, where the riots were occurring. And I was told by my friends that these were riots against the bourgeoisie and by the proletariat. And I looked into the street and I tried to find members of the proletariat. The only ones I could see were wearing policemen's uniforms. The rest were transparently bourgeoisie in their Maoist tunics and so on, and tearing up cobblestones, smashing windows. Of course, it very soon became clear that this was simply street theatre. But what was interesting to me, as an intellectual, I suppose, was exactly what was animating them. I used to interrogate my friends about why it was they were destroying the greatest city in Europe, and why they were setting themselves against the greatest political leader they'd ever had.
Whose memoirs you were reading actually at the time.
Yes, I was reading the Mémoires de Guerre, and I was deeply impressed not just by the attitude that he took, which was there in that first sentence, longtemps je me suis fait une certaine idée de la France. I've made for myself a certain idea of France. And I said, yes, that's what I want to do too. And I agree with everything that you are implying. The very fact that this sentence was borrowed in its rhythm from Proust, from the opening sentence of Recherche du temps perdu, that just struck such a chord in me. I thought, if only we had politicians like that, who could, as it were, invoke the whole culture of their nation in the first sentence of their memoirs, that would be fantastic.
And you trace a lot of your life history as a conservative philosopher and thinker back to those events in Paris.
Yes.
For you, that's where it started.
It did, because I didn't know anything about anything at the time. I was just reading things. But looking down into the street, I said to myself, whatever it is that those people think, I think the opposite. And I'm going to find out what it is.
And you go back for an academic career in England, and you find universities which have already been affected by 68, don't you?
Yes, I mean, I ended up in the University of London, where 68...
You choose one of the most left-wing places in Britain, it has to be said, Birkbeck at the time, which was a strange choice for a Conservative.
It wasn't. It chose me. I mean, there were no jobs at the time. I was just fantastically lucky to get one. And 68 hit Birkbeck, it's true, but only in 1971. And it seemed to coincide with my arrival. I think I brought the wind of change with me. But Birkbeck, although it's a left establishment university, its students, especially at the time, were in full-time employment. That was a condition, and they came only in the evening, so they were respectable middle-class people too. And for them, as for me, it was all about ideas, and it was really interesting to discuss those ideas. I mean, I saw the good thing about 68 for me was that it made Marxism articulate again. You had to argue with it, you know, one aspect that people never really touch on, and I think is really important, is the roots of that French Marxism, you know, which go very deep. And the whole idea of a revolt against the bourgeoisie, that word bourgeois, it comes out of 19th century Marxism, and it's an absurd word when you try and think it through, but you know, a potent word, the French Communist Party was still a very important force in 1968, and one member of it, Pol Pot, for instance,
of course, yes.
Being radically influenced by Sartre, goes back to Cambodia with the message, and the result is 4 million deaths. You know, this is quite radical.
We'll come on to Sartre in a moment, but before we leave de Gaulle, Richard, I think you say in your book that it's likely that the biggest single demonstration in Paris in 1968 was a pro-de Gaulle demonstration.
Well, there's a big demonstration at the very end of May, yes, which is a pro-de Gaulle demonstration. Though, it seems to me de Gaulle is... I mean, I'm as fascinated as you are, Roger, by de Gaulle. I think that wonderful opening line of the memoirs, one should always cite the net line that comes after it, which British Conservatives never do, which is like the princess in the fairy tales. So de Gaulle does know it's a fairy tale, and he knows that fairy tales are necessary. I think also that the fairy tale, the enchantment, is beginning to wear off a bit about de Gaulle in 68, don't you think? A lot of people say the de Gaulle of 68 is not the de Gaulle of 1940, and even the students quite often end up as people who either at the time or retrospectively, like Regis Debray, do admire de Gaulle, but who say the de Gaulle of 68 is a kind of old man.
Absolutely. I mean, you make this point very well in your book, that there was a genuine decline in de Gaulle. I sense the same decline in myself. You know, I think none of us are immune, but nevertheless, that's not really the point. A political figurehead is allowed to decline because you think of him only in terms of his moment of grandeur.
We're talking about generations here and the shift from one to another. Roger, your father was a man of the left, I think. Can you talk about the influence that he had on you again at the same period when you choose the Conservative side of the argument?
Well, my father was an old-fashioned trade union Labour Party member, and he had no sympathy for student revolutions and things like that, no sympathy for students at all, or for me as a student. You know, he thought the whole thing was a conspiracy to undermine the legitimate claims of the working class, and people shouldn't get ahead of themselves in this way. So it was a very different kind of leftism I was brought up in. It had that resentful side, which I didn't like, but it also had that rooted English side that you get also in people like E.P. Thompson, and so on, that sense of identity with the working class, and with people who'd had to migrate to cities from the rural idyll and wanted nevertheless to get back to it. And
a bit of William Morris and all of that.
All that. And I felt great sympathy for that, although it's unbelievable now in the world in which we live.
Absolutely. Well, one of the other things going obviously on in Paris at the time is a really powerful intellectualism on the left. You talked about, lots and lots of different groups and the situationists going on. And this derives from Paris's role at this period as the intellectual capital of the Western world, which, Agnès Poirier, you locate very much in the experiences of the early part, I suppose, of the Second World War and then what follows from there.
Well, yes, the occupation of Paris and of half of France and then the whole of France, I think was quite an incredible period in which a lot of French intellectuals, but not only, American writers that I talk about in the book, and Europeans who either fought during the war or arrived in Paris just after, were completely informed and shaped from that moment. Living in London or New York during the war was utterly unlike.
You make a very, very good contrast between London, which is being physically devastated at the same time as Paris is not being. But the Parisians, unlike the Londoners, are living next door to their occupiers, and very, very strong anti-Semitic, conservative French people who are collaborating with the Germans are living and working and eating and drinking coffee with Resistants at the same time. So it's a very strange atmosphere of rubbing philosophies literally against each other.
Yes, and that moral ambiguity that springs from it. Jean-Paul Sartre writes so well about it in the letter to British readers in 1945. And he said, imagine, it's so easy when the enemy is on the battlefield. You've got a weapon, he's got a weapon, and if you don't shoot him, then, you're dead. In occupied Paris, who is the enemy? Is it the Nazi officer who gives up his seat for an elderly lady on the metro? Is it polite soldiers in the streets, lost in the streets of Paris and asking for direction? The enemy is this invisible octopus, he talks about it. For instance, you call a friend on the telephone, and the telephone and it rings and rings and rings. You go to their place, and the concierge says, well, I haven't seen them in some time. The concierge opens the door, and then you see in the entrance 2 chairs side by side and German cigarettes butts on the floor.
And you know what's happened.
And you know what's happened, but, people vanished. That's how they called it. They were taken away.
And so no one
the enemy,
talks about it.
And no, out of caution perhaps, or just modesty. And so the enemy is everywhere. But do you get to actually hate? There's a familiarity with the occupants, and it creates that. I think it's really what informed and shaped people like Sartre and Beauvoir and Camus, but also later Norman Mailer or Richard
Absolutely.
Wright.
They come in.
Yes.
And you talk about Sartre there, and we should say this is the Sartre well before the Maoist Sartre that's perhaps better known, we were discussing earlier on. And at this point, there is the American way and there is the Soviet way. And the French project, or Sartre's project, in many respects, is to find a third way, a new way of living between those two alternatives.
Well, everybody looked for a third way at that time. There are crucial few years just after the war. And there's the elation of the liberation. When Raymond Aron and Jean-Paul Sartre were still talking, when Arthur Koestler and Camus and Sartre and Beauvoir were all friends. And they tried so hard. Jean-Paul Sartre, actually, who before the war just wanted to become the next Flaubert, and then he realized with the war that he needed to become engaged, committed, intellectual.
And he's always criticised for not really being a resistant, but in fact, as you make clear in your book, he is very, very engaged in political work, setting up a party, publishing his magazine and so on.
Of course. He's not as active a resistant as Camus, for instance, and many other, or Raymond Aron, who actually went straight away to London to be with de Gaulle. But he's fighting with words, and so just after the war, he set up a political party. Imagine. It got, momentum, not for a very long time. He invested a lot of his personal finances, and typically his looking for that third way. His party was called Rassemblement Révolutionnaire Démocratique, as if there was a revolutionary centre. I think we're still looking for that revolutionary centre. Perhaps Macron thinks he's the revolutionary centre.
We'll come on to Macron in just a moment.
But there were
let me ask you about
yes.
Simone de Beauvoir, who's, again, with the second sex, a very, very influential figure all the way through the period we've been talking about, right into 68 and beyond. And what's, again, interesting is she is trying to find a radically different way of living as a woman, and she pushes it about as far as it can be pushed. There's a wonderful scene in your book where where she's having some people around for a dinner party and she's not prepared to cook for them, really.
Well, I mean, she's not a great cook, but at the time, especially having lived through the war, you had just tins. You were happy if you just have cold ham and
But she
some
said
potatoes.
she wished she had a house husband to open the tins for her.
Yes, well, that's what she says playfully in a letter to her lover, Nelson Algren. But the idea behind the second sex was given to her by Sartre. Sartre said, why don't you look into the experience of being educated?
A little essay might be.
A little essay. She thought it was going to be a short article. And at first she couldn't understand because she had been brought up not very differently from boys because her father wanted a boy and she was very gifted and so she was pushed. And then she went to the National Library on Rue de Richelieu and started looking at myths, and then suddenly a whole world opened for her. And it became a 1,000-page 2 volumes book called The Second Sex, which became the feminist Bible.
Absolutely. And she's an extraordinary figure because she's also leading a very complicated love life of her own and fictionalising it, in a sense publicising her own private life through novels.
Yes, it was what we call today autofiction, but they were workaholics, Sartre and Camus and Beauvoir and the rest of it, partying hard, as you say, with a very colourful and diverse sexual life, but also working 14 hours a day, extremely
on very
disciplined.
few calories most of the time, certainly the immediate aftermath
and
of
a lot
war.
of
amphetamines.
Exactly, that's what I was going to say, a lot of drugs.
A lot of drugs, a lot of cigarettes.
Over the counter, though, not illegal at the time.
Yeah. There are so many good stories in this, Agnes, and I have to ask you about one, which is lots of people wonder why Beckett called Waiting for Godot. And you reveal the story in your book.
Well, it's just one of the many hypotheses. Samuel Beckett was fond of prostitutes, and he would often go to Rue Godot de Mauroy in the 9th arrondissement of Paris, which is still quite famous for its prostitutes. And so he went there. He confided into his friend called Leventhal in the early 50s. And he went there, and a woman said, "Do you need my services?" And he declined. And so she laughed, and she said, "Oh, who are you waiting for, Godot?" And he, for a very long time, he said that it might be a pun on God or something, but I don't buy it.
This is why it comes. And since we're talking about Beckett, we should say that he is as much French as Irish in this period. I mean, certainly he is a serious figure in the resistance as well, very, very engaged in the intellectual life of Paris. So we should think of him really as a French writer as much as an English writer.
Well, it's like Picasso. We always think that he's French.
Yeah, you appropriate people all over the place. It's terrible. Sophie Pedder.
One of the things I really enjoyed about Agnes's book was the sense of geography, and you call it left bank, and it very much everything seems to take part in this sort of few streets on the left bank of Paris. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about, the role, how Paris related to the rest of France, and that obviously there's the occupation and the splitting of France in two. But Paris's influence and it's sort of everything taking place in the city, in the capital. How do you feel? Sort of, was that France or was that just Paris?
Well, that's a good question. Only a non-French person could ask. I'm a Parisian. France is such a centralized country, and so since the French Revolution, one would argue in a very Parisian way, there's only Paris.
You boil everything down. You say it's not the 68 years, it's 68. It's not 68, it's just the spring of 68. It's not the spring of 68, it's just May of 68. No, it's a few days in May 68. And similarly, it's not France, it's Paris. It's not Paris,
but
it's
Paris
the left bank of Paris. It's only one arrondissement. and it's only a few streets in one arrondissement.
Paris is France and France is Paris.
But isn't that what draws us all to Paris? That concentration of the whole life of a nation and all of its history in one beautiful place.
That's absolutely
something
right.
that we don't have in England, and we long for it.
It is. It's part of what draws us to France, but it also is very deceptive, isn't it? Because it makes us think that we understand France through what we experience and what we know about Paris and the capital.
Richard Violin.
I was just thinking, I remember once having to get a review copy out of the press service at Gallimard, the publishers, and I realised their press service is divided into two sections, one of which is Paris and the other is provinces and abroad.
Great. Well, let's start to bring this a little bit up to date, because Sophie Pedder, you've been studying, you've interviewed Emmanuel Macron many times, and you've written a book about him and his France. And I suppose there's a sense, I don't want to be offensive to anybody, that Paris went through its great period in the 50s and 60s and has been in some sort of intellectual decline since then, but maybe things are beginning to pick up again right now.
Well, I don't know if you can talk about an intellectual revival yet, but what I think you can talk about is the fact that France has gone through a long period of several decades, I think, of feeling very morose and as if its past is behind it and it doesn't know quite what the future holds, pessimism, sort of declinism, as the French call it. And what happened last year at the election, where Macron came from nowhere, at least that's the way it looked, and took the presidency and defeated populism, went against all the trends that were engulfing other countries across the world, certainly in the West, and won from nowhere with a party that was barely a year old, I think gave the French a huge boost in confidence and an ability to think that they were actually capable of things. I mean, we forget that. We talk about this wonderful era in the of sort of intellectual effervescence in the past, but actually the French had really lost that. So I think that that's come back.
That's very interesting, because we like the idea there's big historical forces and reasons behind things, but actually Macron was also unbelievably lucky in his opponents and the way that complex presidential electoral race fell out.
Well, he was lucky in some respects, and one of the things I try to unpick in this book is to what degree, it was just sort of luck. I don't think it was. I think he was somebody who made his own luck. He created his chances. He knew how to exploit them the minute they came his way. He was helped by an electoral system with a presidential two-round system, which enables, someone who in the end only got 24% of the first round vote to go through to the second round.
In the first round you vote for who you want, and in the second round you vote against who you fear.
That's the theory, but I think one has to remember that equally in the past, there are presidents who were elected with less than 24%. You think back to Chirac, who was never elected in the first round with more than that. So it's not an illegitimate electoral system as a result.
He was lucky in some of his opponents.
He was, but I do think I've tried to argue this pretty strongly that he created his chances. He knew exactly how to exploit them. He took a lot of risks. He launched his party when he had told Hollande, the president he was working for at the time as a minister, he told Hollande, it's just a citizens' movement. Well, he knew perfectly well at the time it wasn't just a citizens' movement. This was a political party.
And Hollande is still ragingly angry with
Hollande, who's just published his own book, is furious and sees it as a betrayal, which it was. And Macron played that a little bit duplicitously in the way. But, that's what a politician has to do if you want to become president of a country like France.
And a little bit like de Gaulle, only in this sense he has an idea of France and his own role in France, famously describing himself as being Jupiter-like, and that great walk he does after he wins the presidency.
Well, I think Macron's an interesting, complex character, which is one of the reasons I wanted to really try and understand him, try and explain him. He is at the same time, he believes in this sort of vertical approach to authority. He has a conception of power which is quite de Gaulle-like. He believes in the president being the father of the nation, all the sort of symbols of power, inviting Putin to Versailles, to the Palace of Versailles. I mean, this is something that presidents in France don't do, but he likes this idea of sort of imperial grandeur for France. But at the same time, he has actually built something that is. He comes from the left. Don't forget that Macron was once upon a time a card-carrying member of the Socialist Party. He was a minister in a socialist government. He comes from the left, the Ricardian left, so what they call
these kind of people here as well.
Yes, and there are echoes. He won't like this. Macron doesn't like to be compared to Tony Blair, but there are echoes of sort of there's the centre left, third way politics and what he's trying to do. And
you've emphasised in your writing that we should not see him as a Thatcherite figure. He wants labour reforms. He's fighting the railway workers and groups of students right now, but he is not a radical reformer on the Anglo-Saxon model.
Yes, I think he's a radical reformer, but I don't think he's a Thatcherite, and I think he would deny that that's what he's trying to do, and I think quite rightly so. You wouldn't get anywhere in France trying to do that. What I think he's trying to do is modernise the French model, keep things very French, good public services, a strong safety net. He doesn't believe in a sort of laissez-faire, let everyone, to survive by themselves. He believes in doing things the French way, but putting that on a sort of sound financial basis, and that's what these current strikes are all about.
And is this why? I mean, it looks a bit like '68 occasionally. You see these big student demonstrations and lots of flares going off. The Cheminot, the railway workers are striking all the time at the moment. It feels like there's a really big period of unrest, but it's not presumably like '68 because you've got a president who will ultimately come to some kind of arrangement.
Well, possibly. I mean, don't forget Macron was born a decade after 1968.
Doesn't remember any of it.
Absolutely. He was born in 1977. He is absolutely not a child of '68 at all. It's for him, it's history books. It's not something, he's no complexes about '68 at all. And he's got a very sort of critical reading of what happened to France in the post-'68 period. But these particular strikes, I think, there is always that sense, the temptation to sort of reach for history when there's a French strike going on, and there are student sit-ins, at Nanterre, which where originally the '68 rebellion began before it spread to the Sorbonne, and the Sorbonne is also, there were sit-ins there. So there's a sort of superficial similarities, but it's not like, this is not '68. This is these are very specific demands about changes to statutes.
You mentioned Nanterre just now. There's a very interesting fact about Macron, which I think I certainly hadn't realised. We knew he was a kind of énarque. He'd gone to Sciences Po. He was a Grand Lycée guy, very, very bright, very much part of the elite establishment. But at the same time as he's at Sciences Po, he chooses to go to Nanterre. Just tell us about how weird that is.
It is. It's fascinating. And, at the time, he decided to do a parallel degree. So he was studying at Sciences Po at the end of the 1990s, beginning of the 2000. But he chose to do a parallel degree in philosophy at Nanterre, which, when you're a student in Sciences Po on the left bank, this is the sort of chic part of Paris now. It's cafes and cinemas and bookstores. If you go and do your philosophy degree at Nanterre, that means getting on a sort of RER suburban railway, going out to the concrete block campus west of Paris in Nanterre that Richard described earlier. This is a very different sort of student experience, and he decided to do both, which, again, it's part of, he likes to do things differently. Macron, he is someone, he launched his own party. He doesn't like to go down the beaten track.
Roger Scruton.
Yes, I think this is all very interesting, the comparison between now and '68 from the student point of view, because one thing that was noticeable in '68 was not just that the students were protesting, but that they were taking the idea of protest seriously as an art form, and that they would daub the walls with witty slogans which revealed a level of education that modern students can't aspire to, a modern
prohibition is prohibited.
Yes, that sort of thing. A modern sit-in, if you look at the thing that you mentioned earlier, the roads must go. Demonstration in Oxford is completely inarticulate, empty, just belligerent shouting. Whereas, although there was a lot of belligerent shouting in May '68, there was also an awful lot of sophisticated comment on the way things are.
This is what I love about a conservative philosopher. Everything was better in the past, even the radical demonstrators of higher quality of lefty.
Not everything was better. It's right. You're absolutely right that it's that of course it is a part of my instinct to suppose that things must have been better, but at the time they didn't look good at all, because what was under threat, to me at least, was the whole idea that, summarised in that term bourgeois, the way in which France had come to terms with itself was a genuine integrated community where people went to work, got dressed up on Sundays, entertained each other. There was Balzac all revived.
One of the astonishing things about the student protest right now is that the reason that they are protesting is exactly the same reason, one of them, that they were back in '68. This is against selection at university, which, which lays this out in your book, and you've got exactly the same debate. It's astonishing but true that in French universities there is no selection for undergraduates. This is something which is possibly going to change under Macron.
And Could you explain
and
how
they're not happy.
incredibly limited his proposals are? Simply that if you're going to be studying maths at university, you'd have studied a little bit of maths beforehand as well.
This is I interviewed the head of a French university, who he, you know, of 300 of his French undergraduates had done he was taking 80 of them had not done the bac S, which is the maths bac, the bac that actually prepares you for a maths undergraduate course. And of course, they all drop out after the first year. They can't pass their exams. And this is a sort of, it's not selection on merit so much as just sort of appropriate background for studying course. This is what he's trying to do, and this is what has brought the students onto the streets and sitting in sit-ins again.
Agnès Poirier, what do you think is the intellectual inheritance of the period that you're writing about today? How much of that great period of the French intellectuals and the Café de Flore and Sartre and Beauvoir and all the rest of it remains in the French mind today, do you think?
Well, I'm not sure we've got... I mean, there are great minds in France now, but I think the spirit of the left bank is now can be found in other countries and in other cities. You know, Paris doesn't have that monopoly anymore of being that place where debate is so intense and so rich. And it's interesting, for instance, that somebody who was a 68ard, Alain Finkielkraut, who is one of the luminaries and great mind today, talks about May 68. He's extremely critical of May 68. He said it was such a poetical moment, but it was what we've got now is all the stupidity of it. And I mean, I don't know what Sophie thinks about it, because you need not to be French to actually see this with distance.
One of the things I think that's happened is that some of the people that are treated as intellectuals in France at the moment are in fact, you know, sort of media figures. They are invited. I think of someone like Eric Zemmour, they're invited. They are neoconservative in some cases. I mean, not at all from the left. And Alain Finkielkraut is another good example of that. They are animated by very different sort of ideas. There's a lot of concern about Islam, the role of Islam in France. And so it's an odd sort of legacy that has taken place in that respect.
Richard Vinan.
Sure. Now, one of the things that everything fascinates me about Macron, but one of the things that fascinates me is that he's a young man who admires the old. And one of the people he admires, of course, is Daniel Cohn-Bendit, who is one of his supporters. So this man born after 68, although, as you say, is critical about the legacy of 68, picks up support from old Soissons-Huitard.
You can take 68 out of the country, but it always sneaks back. Thank you to all my guests today, Sir Roger Scruton, Agnès Poirier's Left Bank, Art, Passion and the Rebirth of Paris 1940 to 1950, and Richard Vinan's The Long 68, Radical Protest and Its Enemies, are both out now, and Sophie Pedder's biography of Emmanuel Macron, Révolution Française, will be out in June. Next week, Tom Sutcliffe on the never-ending pursuit of happiness. But for now, thank you and goodbye.